I've always liked quiet nights alone. There's something peaceful about hearing nothing but the hum of your own house, the faint buzz of the fridge, the wind brushing past the windows, the occasional creak of wood as if the walls are breathing. But sometimes silence carries more than peace. Sometimes it carries things you were never supposed to hear. This first story happened on a rainy night last fall, when I learned that being home alone doesn't always mean you're actually alone. It was a Friday, and the storm had been rolling in since the afternoon. Thick clouds dimmed everything before sunset, and by 7 the sky looked like a smear of ink. I was 24, living alone in a small rented house on the edge of a quiet suburb, a place so calm it felt almost staged. I had just moved there for work, so most of my evenings were the same. Quick dinner, YouTube on low volume, and scrolling through my phone until I got tired. That night, I made soup, lit a candle because the power kept flickering, and settled on the couch. The rain was steady, not violent, but heavy enough to cover any outside noise. Every so often lightning flashed through the blinds, and for a second, the living room glowed like a snapshot. The smell of wet dirt seeped through the window frame. Around 9, the lights finally went out for good. The house fell into that thick, suffocating silence that comes right after electricity dies, when every hum, every constant tone suddenly vanishes. I lit 2 more candles and sat there for a while, listening to the rain. It was kind of cozy, honestly. I even thought about making a cup of tea. Then I heard it. A single heavy thump from above me, like someone stepping onto the roof. It wasn't thunder. The sound was too close, too defined. I froze mid-step, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. For a moment I thought it might be a branch falling from the old oak beside the house. I waited for another one. Nothing. Just the rain. I shook it off, told myself it was the wind, and went to the kitchen. When I turned on the flashlight from my phone, the light bounced off the wet window pane. In that reflection behind my own face, I thought I saw movement. Just a faint blur near the hallway that leads to the bedrooms. My heart skipped, but when I turned, it was empty. That's when the second sound came. A dragging scrape, this time directly above me. Slow, deliberate. The ceiling creaked under weight, faint but rhythmic. I stood there listening. One step, pause. Another step. It was coming from the attic space that ran above my bedroom. I'd been up there once when I moved in, just to store some boxes. The access was a wooden panel in the hallway ceiling, with a string to pull it down. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but it didn't sound like one. Too heavy, too slow, too aware. For about 30 seconds, everything went quiet again. I thought maybe it had left. Then as I walked back toward the living room, a sudden pop echoed from somewhere above, like a board snapping slightly. My flashlight trembled in my hand. I decided to call someone. But who? It was late, and I didn't really know my neighbors yet. The storm had cut off cell reception earlier. There were no bars. I even tried opening the front door, thinking maybe I could run to my car, but the wind outside was fierce, sheets of rain blinding everything. So I waited. I sat on the couch with my flashlight and a kitchen knife beside me, listening to every creak. Every few minutes I'd glance up at the ceiling. Then I noticed something strange. The faint smell of dust, like old insulation or dry wood coming from the hallway. It wasn't there before. When I shined the light toward the attic hatch, I saw a thin line of something drifting down. Dust. And then just barely, the string to the attic door moved. Not from the wind, and it lifted like a finger brushed against it. I backed away slowly. My breath felt shallow. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The air seemed thicker, heavier somehow. I pointed the light up again, but now everything was still. The string hung perfectly motionless. Then the scratching started. Soft at first, like nails or something dragging along wood. It came from directly above the hatch. I whispered to myself, "It's an animal." Over and over. But the sound grew faster, closer, and then silence. I don't know how long I stood there staring. Maybe 10 minutes. The rain outside eased, and for a moment I thought the worst was over. That's when I heard the third sound. From inside the hallway itself. A low muffled thud like something had dropped onto the floorboards. That broke me. I bolted for the door, ran barefoot through the rain and didn't stop until I reached my car. I sat there soaked, shivering, gripping the steering wheel, watching the house. No movement, no lights. Just the flicker of lightning behind the clouds. After about 15 minutes, I finally got a signal. I called the police. They arrived maybe 20 minutes later. 2 officers with flashlights checking every corner while I waited outside. One of them called me in after a while. He said, "Sir, you might want to see this." They'd found the attic hatch slightly open. Not enough to be obvious, but not how I left it. Inside there were footprints in the dust. Bare ones, human but smaller than mine. And tucked behind the insulation were old items. A pair of shoes, a cracked phone, a hairbrush, and a faded photo of a young woman with a date written on the back, 2012. The officer said there'd been a missing person case from that year. The address on her driver's license matched my house. I moved out 2 weeks later. The landlord never answered when I asked about the photo. Sometimes when it rains hard at night, I still find myself listening for that sound. That slow, deliberate drag across the ceiling. And wondering if maybe she never really left. It was midwinter, the kind of week where it feels like the sun barely rises at all. I lived in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a quiet building. The kind built in the 80s. Faded hallways, humming radiators, doors that never fully shut without a push. I'd moved in after a breakup and I was still getting used to the silence. You don't really realize how much noise another person makes until you live without it. The small clicks of their phone, footsteps between rooms, the sound of another breath in the dark. That Tuesday night, the building felt hollow. The snow had been falling since morning, soft and steady, layering everything in a muted white. The parking lot below was buried, and most of the tenants had already left for the holidays. Only a few cars remained, including mine. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked, the streetlight reflecting off the ice. Around 9, I made some coffee and turned on an old movie. The radiator hissed and clicked in the corner. One of those sounds you eventually tune out. I scrolled through my phone, answered a few messages, and thought about going to bed early. Then I heard a knock. 3 slow taps. It wasn't loud, but clear and deliberate. I looked toward the door. It was the kind of knock that didn't sound like a neighbor. Not friendly or rushed, just patient. I waited, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. The movie played softly in the background. After a few seconds, it came again. Same rhythm, 3 dull knocks. I muted the TV. My first thought was maybe a delivery mix-up, though it was almost 10. When I looked through the peephole, there was no one. Just the dim yellow light from the hallway bulb flickering slightly. I opened the door a crack and looked out. The hallway was empty, quiet still. The air was colder than it should have been. I leaned forward and noticed something on the floor near the welcome mat. A folded piece of paper. It had no name on it, just my apartment number written in pencil. I picked it up and closed the door behind me, locking it. The paper was rough, like torn from a notebook. Inside, written in shaky handwriting, were 6 words. "Stop moving the furniture at night." I froze. I hadn't moved anything. Not in weeks. My first thought was that it was from the guy below me. Apartment 203. I'd only seen him once in the laundry room, quiet older man with heavy glasses. Maybe he was hearing the radiator creak and thought it was me dragging furniture around. I laughed it off, threw the note on the counter, and went back to my movie. But around midnight I started hearing it too. A dull scrape, faint but steady, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Only it wasn't coming from above or below. It was coming from inside my own apartment. I muted the TV again. The sound stopped immediately. I sat still listening, my eyes scanning the room. The only light came from the TV screen, a faint blue glow across the walls. I stood up slow and careful, trying to track the direction. It had come from the spare room, the one I barely used. I walked over, turned the handle, and pushed the door open. The room was dark but empty, just boxes and an old chair. Nothing had moved. I turned to go back, and as I did, something brushed against my leg. Soft light, like air shifting. I froze. The door to the hallway creaked behind me, even though I'd left it open. I told myself it was a draft from the window and went to check, but the window was shut tight. No air, no movement. Still, the cold lingered. That kind of chill that feels like it's seeping from inside the walls. I went back to the living room, turned the TV on again, but couldn't relax. Every creak made me twitch. I kept glancing toward that spare room, half expecting to see the door moving. At around 1, I decided to just go to bed. I locked the front door again, double-checked the windows, turned off the lights, and lay down. I could still hear faint scraping every few minutes, distant, uneven, like something shifting weight. Eventually, I drifted into a light sleep. At 3:12, I woke up suddenly. No reason, just that gut feeling you get when something's wrong. The room was quiet but not empty. You can feel when air changes, when someone else is breathing near you. I sat up, straining to hear. Then came a sound, faint but unmistakable. The soft groan of a floorboard, not from the living room, from inside my bedroom. I turned my head slowly toward the corner near the closet. It was too dark to see much, but I could make out the faint outline of the door, slightly open. I knew I'd closed it. I always did. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight. The screen lit up, and in that split second of dim light, I saw something. Not a face, not a clear figure, just movement. A blur ducking back into the darkness of the closet. I dropped the phone. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I jumped out of bed, ran to the door, and grabbed the handle, locked from the inside. My hands shook as I twisted it open. I ran into the hallway, slammed the door behind me, and pressed my back against the wall. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The silence pressed against me like weight. I dialed 911. The operator asked if anyone else was in the apartment. I said yes, I thought so. I didn't know. The police arrived in less than 10 minutes. 2 officers, flashlights drawn, went through every room. When they opened the closet in my bedroom, it looked empty. At first. Then one of them pointed the light up. There was a panel in the ceiling leading into the crawl space between floors. It was shifted slightly out of place. The officer climbed up, shining the light through the gap. When he came down, he was holding something. A small handheld mirror smudged with fingerprints, and an empty sandwich wrapper. He asked me if I knew who lived below me. I told him apartment 203, the quiet guy. They went down to check. A few minutes later, one of the officers came back up, face pale. The man in 203 wasn't there. The door was open, Lights off, apartment completely empty. Except for one thing on the kitchen table. A single torn notebook page. The same kind as the note I'd found earlier. It said, "He keeps moving things when I sleep. They never found him." The landlord said he'd lived there for years. Alone, paid on time, never complained about anyone. But when they looked through the building's old records, apartment 203 had been listed as vacant for almost 6 months. I moved out the next day. Sometimes late at night when the world is quiet and still, I swear I can hear that same faint dragging sound again. Slow, rhythmic, just beyond the walls. And I can't help but wonder whose furniture is being moved now. When I think about that night, it doesn't feel like a memory. It feels like something that's still happening, over and over every time the house creaks or the lights flicker. I just moved into my late grandfather's place after he passed. It was an old single-story home at the edge of town. Quiet, surrounded by trees. The kind of place that always smelled faintly of dust and pine. He'd lived there for nearly 50 years, and after the funeral, I was the only one willing to take it. It was peaceful in a way. Familiar. I'd spent summers there as a kid, catching fireflies in the backyard and watching thunderstorms roll through the forest. But as an adult, being there alone felt different. Emptier, heavier somehow. The house held a kind of silence that wasn't just quiet. It listened. The first week was fine. I cleaned unpacked boxes, fixed a few leaks. The neighbors were kind but distant. An older couple across the road and a man who worked nights at a gas station. No one came by much. That was fine with me. It was on the 7th night that things started to change. I was sitting in the living room reading, when I heard the front door creak. Slow, soft, like someone was easing it open. My heart jumped. I set the book down, stood up quietly and listened. The sound stopped. I waited, then walked to the hallway. The front door was still shut, locked, chain in place. I told myself it was the woods settling. Old houses do that. But when I came back into the living room, my book was gone. I searched everywhere. Under the couch, between cushions, even checked the kitchen counter. I finally found it on the coffee table, open to a completely different page than where I'd left it. I brushed it off, convinced I'd just forgotten. But it stuck in my mind. Over the next few nights, small things began shifting. My keys weren't where I left them. The kitchen light would be on when I woke up, even though I always turned everything off before bed. And one night, I woke up to the faint sound of a chair scraping across the floor from the dining room. I walked out, half asleep, the floor cold under my feet. The chair was slightly pulled out from the table, just one, like someone had been sitting there waiting. I stood there staring at it for a long time. The air felt thick, unmoving. I pushed the chair back in and went to bed, leaving the light on. The next morning I found something that made my stomach twist. On the wall by the dining table, faint but visible under the morning light, was a smudge. Like someone had run their hand down the paint. The streak was long, almost to the floor, and darker near the bottom, as if whoever touched it had dirty fingers. I tried to wipe it off, but the mark wouldn't completely fade. It was like it had seeped into the paint itself. That evening, I called my mom to tell her about it. She got quiet when I mentioned the handprint. Then she told me something I'd never heard before. When my grandfather was still alive, he'd started calling her in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was using his house while he slept. He'd find dishes in the sink, the front door unlocked, chairs moved. He thought maybe he was losing his mind. The doctor said it was early dementia. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak sounded like footsteps. I sat in bed, watching the shadows crawl across the ceiling until the morning light came. 2 days later, I installed a small motion sensor camera in the hallway. Just a cheap one facing the living room. I didn't really expect to catch anything. I just wanted peace of mind. That night it snowed hard. The power flickered a few times, and I remember sitting with a candle, trying to read, but unable to focus. Around midnight, I gave up and went to bed. When I woke up, my phone had a notification. Motion detected, 2:41 a.m. I opened the app. The footage was grainy and dark. The timestamp blinked in the corner. At first, nothing moved, just the faint static of the night camera. The living room bathed in ghostly gray light. Then slowly a figure stepped into frame, not from the front door, but from the hallway, from inside the house. It was tall, thin, wearing something loose like old clothes or pajamas. The figure moved slowly, its head turning toward the camera, but the face was impossible to make out. Blurred, almost erased by the distortion. It stood there for a long time, then tilted its head slightly, like it was listening. After about 30 seconds, it turned and walked toward the kitchen. The motion sensor didn't trigger again. I sat frozen, staring at my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I checked the locks, the windows, every closet and corner of the house. Nothing. No footprints outside, no sign of entry. The next night I stayed up with the lights on. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the same sound again. The chair sliding across the floor. This time I didn't move. I sat in my room, holding my phone, trying to breathe quietly. Then came a new sound. A faint tapping, slow, rhythmic, from the hallway near my bedroom door. I couldn't see much through the crack under the door, just the faintest shadow shifting back and forth. Then the tapping stopped. Something whispered, just one word. My name? I think that was the first time in my life I truly froze. My body refused to move, like even breathing might draw attention. The whisper came again, lower, like a breath pressed against the door. Then silence. When morning came, I left, drove into town, sat in a diner for hours until the sun was high. I called a locksmith to replace every lock in the house. I didn't tell him why. That evening, I almost convinced myself it was a dream. I opened the app again to delete the footage. But before I could, I noticed something new. Another notification. Motion detected, 6:13 a.m. That was around the time I'd left the house. I pressed play. The video showed the front door still locked. But in the corner of the frame near the dining table, something glinted. A reflection from the wall. I zoomed in and my stomach turned. There was a new handprint. Fresh. This one was smaller, higher up. And next to it, written faintly in what looked like chalk, was a word. Stay. I didn't. I packed what I could and left that afternoon. Moved into a friend's apartment across town. A week later, the local news ran a short piece about a house fire on the outskirts of town. The address was mine. They said it started in the living room 'cause undetermined. The only odd detail mentioned was that the fire department found a body in the crawl space beneath the floorboards. A man in his 70s, long dead, wrapped in a blanket. They said he'd likely been there for years. The property records confirmed it. My grandfather's old home was built on top of a smaller structure that had partially collapsed decades earlier. The crawl space had once been part of it. The coroner couldn't identify the remains right away. But what unsettled me most was what they found next to him. A small notebook, pages filled with shaky handwriting. The final entry said, He moves when I sleep. He uses my house. I never went back. But sometimes, even in my new apartment, when the night feels too quiet, and I wake up to a sound that doesn't belong, I think about that camera footage, the way the figure tilted its head, listening. And I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to make sure I could hear it too.